So I would like to welcome our first speaker, André Martins, who is from the Instituto Superior Técnico in Portugal, who will talk about explainable and uncertainty-aware NLP. Thank you.
Okay, so, well, first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, unfortunately remotely. So my name is André Martins. I'm a research scientist at Unbabel. I'm a researcher at the Telecomunicações Institute and a professor at Técnico in Lisbon. And today I'm going to talk about how can we move towards explainable and uncertainty-aware NLP. So I should start by saying that the work that I'm going to present today has been done by this amazing team of students and researchers and collaborators. Together we formed the SARDIN group. It stands for Structure Aware Modeling for Natural Language. And I'm going to revisit these pictures later on as I present several pieces of work. But so the main message for today's talk is, for those of you who I guess are the majority of the audience that are familiar with large language models in NLP and the latest trends in NLP. These days, large models with lots of parameters, they are becoming increasingly powerful. They can, do very well in all benchmarks that are available. They can be adaptable to perform multiple tasks, but I don't think we are done yet. Okay, so there's still, a few things that these models cannot do that are quite important for a practical use of AI. And two things that I think are current limitations of existing systems is their inability to provide good interpretations or good explanations of their decisions to humans, which is particularly important, in a setting where we have humans and AI working together to solve problems. And it's also useful, for example, if you want to understand the failure modes of current systems and debug them. Okay, so these capabilities are very important in order to do that. And those things are very hard to do with the current models that we have available. So this is one current limitation. A second one is the lack of confidence measures. So it's very hard to design models that know when they don't know. And this is important because if, again, we have humans working together with these systems, humans should know when they should rely the system or where they, there's not available information enough such that the output of a system is reliable. And again, this is something that with the current technology, the current training and encoding objectives, we can do this trivially. And today I'm going to talk about one particular task, empty evaluation, that is particularly nuanced in the sense that it has many different sources of uncertainty. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some experiments that we did in this direction. So basically, this talk is going to be divided into two parts. The first part, which is going to be a little bit longer, I'm going to talk a bit about our work on sparsity and structure for explainability. In the second part, I'm going to talk about uncertainty-aware empty evaluation. All right, so let's get started. Let's start with sparse transformations. So the building block for this part are transformations from the Euclidean space to the probability simplex. I don't know if you can see my mouse. Can you see my mouse? No? Yeah. Okay, perfect. Yeah. Okay, so we assume that we have some vector in the Euclidean space. I'm going to call this vector Z. We can think of this, for example, as a vector of scores for words or word logits, if you want. And you want to define a mapping from this vector to a vector of probabilities. Okay, so a vector that lives in the probability simplex, which I'm going to call P. Okay, so we can interpret in this example that these are word probabilities. And I'm going to talk about several possible choices that you can do to define these kind of transformations. But one thing that I'm, highlights that I'm going to give is that we can actually define transformations that are able to capture sparsity and structure. And all the transformations that I'm going to present today have the property that are all end-to-end differentiable, meaning that you can just use gradient backpropagation to learn models that contain these transformations in the middle. They can be used either as hidden layers, for example, as attention mechanisms, or as output layers. We can define a loss function for them. And I'm going to argue that we can use this kind of sparse transformations to make a bridge between the continuous and discrete worlds. This will be a little bit more clear in the sequel. And I'm going to talk about some applications in NLP where this has been successful. Okay, so let's start with a transformation that I guess most of you are familiar with, Softmax. It's a very simple way to map from a vector of scores to probabilities. It's very simple. We just take our vector Z, we exponentiate each component of Z, and by exponentiating, we guarantee that it's going to be positive, and then we normalize, okay? And by construction, because we are ensuring that, because the exponential function is strictly positive, and because we are normalizing, by construction, we're going to end up with a probability vector, okay? And in fact, it's a probability vector that is going to be what we call fully dense, okay? Strictly positive, because the exponential function will never return a zero. It can return probability values that are arbitrarily small if the magnitude of Z is very large, negative large or positive large, but it's never going to be exactly zero. And Softmax, is used all over the place. We can use it both as a loss function, for example, when you use the cross entropy loss, and it can also be used as a hidden layer inside a network when you use, for example, an attention mechanism. The second transformation that is widely used is Arcmax. So this is even simpler than Softmax. So here we take our vector Z, and we just return a one hot vector that points to the largest entry of Z, okay? So one fancy way of writing this transformation is by writing it as an optimization problem where we have a linear objective, where we assign a weight of Z to every dimension, and we want to optimize this Z transpose P, constraining P to be in the simplex. And if we do that, then the optimal solution is going to put all the probability mass in the largest component of Z. So the solution is going to be a one hot vector. Okay, so it's a particular case of a point in the simplex, which is going to be a vertex index in that simplex. Another way to look at Arcmax is as the limit case of Softmax. So if we define a temperature parameter tau, and we make this temperature parameter very small, and we divide our vector Z by tau, then the magnitude of Z is going to be very large, and as a result, the Softmax transformation is going to result in a very peaked probability vector, and in the limit, it's going to be a one-hot vector. Okay, I'm going to call this a temperature trick, and it's something that is widely used also in many different applications. Okay, so we have these two transformations, Softmax and Arcmax. Just to illustrate how they look like, is a simple example. Here Z is a vector with 5 components. And the Softmax transformation will lead to something like this, where the sum of all these blue bars is going to be 1, and the entry with the largest probability is going to be the first one because that's the one that has the largest Z. And the Arcmax transformation will return something like in the right, where it's just a one-hot vector with where all the probability mass goes to the largest entry of Z, and all the other components are going to have a probability of 0. Okay, so Arcmax is an extreme case of sparsity because it's returning a one-hot vector. So we get, in this example, 4 different words that get a probability of 0, but it is discontinuous. And by discontinuous, I mean that if we do like a slight perturbation on our vector Z, if we change this some of these entries only very slightly, then the Arcmax of Z is not going to move. So this bar is not going to move. Okay, we're going to be exactly in the same place. If you make a perturbation that is, not as slight. So if somehow this is going to switch the order of Z, then what's going to happen is that there's going to be a jump to a different bar, at a different for a different word. Okay, so this is a discontinuity. And the discontinuities are tricky because if you want to use these transformations inside a neural network, we are going to get a gradient which is going to be 0 almost everywhere, which means that we cannot really learn with gradient backpropagation using an Arcmax transformation. We can do it with Softmax because Softmax is continuous, but not with Arcmax. And so one question that this raised was if there is any sparse and differentiable alternative to Arcmax. So we would like to have something that still assigns zero probability to some entries of Z, but not as extreme as Arcmax. And the answer is that there is such a transformation. We call it Sparse Max, and I'm going to define it in a minute. And this is something, this will be the result of applying Sparse Max to this same vector Z, okay? So in this case, we'll get a probability for 2 different words. The other 3 words still get a probability of 0. And this is now a continuous transformation. So if we slightly perturb Z, these bars will move a little bit, but in a continuous way. So we can still compute derivatives and we can do gradient backpropagation with this Z. Okay, and by the way, just feel free to interrupt me anytime with questions. Okay, so all right, so let's define Sparse Max a little bit more carefully. The definition is actually pretty simple. We just define, given Z, we define the Sparse Max of Z as the Euclidean projection of Z onto the probability simplex, which means picking the vector P in the simplex that is the closest to Z in terms of Euclidean distance. So we are minimizing the distance between P and Z, which can be expressed as a norm, as the Euclidean norm, as the L2 norm. You know, if we expand the square, another way of writing the same objective, you know, removing some constants, is maximizing a linear objective minus L2 regularizer. So if you just look at this part in black, if we ignore the regularizer, you might notice that this is exactly the same thing that we had here for Arcmax. This is the reason why I wrote Arcmax in this form. So we can regard this as some kind of regularized version of Arcmax, where we add this L2 norm here. Okay. So one nice property of these Euclidean projections into the simplex is that they are likely to hit the boundary of the simplex. So if you want to get some intuition for that, suppose that, I don't know if you are seeing my video there, but suppose that I'm holding a simplex here, okay? And there is a point Z, which is moving farther and farther away from the simplex. As it gets farther and farther away, the Euclidean projection of that point onto the simplex is going to become more likely to hit a corner of the simplex, or if not a corner, a edge, or a boundary point. And the points in the boundary of the simplex are the ones that where some components have probabilities of 0. And this is why Sparse Max of Z is going to be sparse. So despite these facts, this transformation is end-to-end differentiable. I'm not going to show that here, but you know, we have all the proofs in the original paper. This was a paper at ICML 2016. And it's sufficient to do the forward pass. I'm, again, not going to get into details. And it's even cheaper to do the backward pass. All right, so, okay, so, and, but we still kept asking the question about, okay, now we have 3 things. We have Softmax, we have Arcmax, we have Sparse Max. Maybe there is something that connects all these 3 things. And the answer again is yes. So there is something called alpha Antmax, which we came up with later in a paper at ACL, which is exactly a family of transformations that contains as particular cases Softmax. If we set alpha is a scalar parameter. If you set alpha to 1, we just recover Softmax. If we set alpha to 2, we recover Sparse Max. If we let alpha go to infinity, we get Arcmax in the limits. And if we set alpha to a different value, for example, 1.5, and 1.5 is a particularly interesting one. It has some nice properties. I don't have time to describe them here. We get yet another transformation. Okay, and you can see that this transformation is still sparse. Actually, for any value of alpha that is strictly greater than 1, these transformations have a propensity to be sparse. Okay, so everything which is just a little bit above Softmax has some propensity for sparsity. And it's also very easy to play with these things. So we can just do pip install Antmax. We have some code in PyTorch that implements this. And you can use, everywhere you are using Softmax, we can use Arcmax as well as a drop-in replacement for that. So if you are working on a problem for which getting a sparse transformation is something desirable, then this could be something interesting to try out. Okay, so why did I spend 10 minutes talking about this, or 15 minutes? We use this in several places. We use it to develop sparse attention mechanisms for machine translation, and also for morphological inflection and other problems in NLP. We also adapted these things for taking constraints, which are useful to model fertility, which is also an important concept in MT. We also developed ways to obtain adaptive sparsity, in which we can learn alpha as a parameter. And you can plug that in transformers so that we can learn a different alpha for every attention head. This is the topic of this paper, adaptively sparse transformers. And we can also use it in loss functions. Okay, there is a family of losses called Fenchelian losses, for which we can use these sparse transformations there. And I'm not getting into details because there is no time. But we found out that for many problems, including sequence-to-sequence models, this tends to lead to better calibration properties, and it kind of alleviates a problem with beam search that tends to favor short strings. We don't get such a problem at the same scale if we replace Softmax by Arcmax. Okay, so but let me get into the main topic of this talk. One question is if we can use this kind of sparse transformations to improve interpretability of models in NLP. And this work was a first attempt to do that. So this was work done with my student Marcos Treviso that we presented in the Black Box NLP workshop in 2020. And it's kind of an attempt to formalize a little bit how we can define and assess explainability, which is a very hard thing to define. So we assume here that there is some underlying classifier, and this classifier is going to make a prediction. Let's call it y hat. And we have a component called an explainer, and this explainer can be either something internal to the model. It can be some component inside the classifier, or it can be something external. We are flexible about that. And the goal of this explainer is to explain to another model or to a person. We just call it a layperson. We try both doing this with humans and with a small machine learning model. The goal of this explainer is to explain this decision to a layperson by sending a short message. Okay, so we want like a compact message that is a description of why the classifier would pick y hat. Okay, and the layperson is only given the message. It's not given the decision of the classifier, and the goal is for the layperson to simulate the prediction of the classifier, to try to do their own prediction based on this message, which would be a prediction that I'm calling here y tilde. And we could assess the informativeness of this explanation by checking how often y tilde matches y hat. Okay, so this is called simulability or forward simulation prediction. It's something that is something suggested in some of the earliest papers in explainability, and it's one criteria among many others to assess how useful explanations are. Okay, so we the fraction of the time where y tilde matches y hat, I'm going to call it a communication success rate, and this will be like a metric for assessing explainability. So in this same paper, we also draw the connection between classic methods for feature selection. I'm calling that model interpretability. So in those models, usually you want to select features to get into the model. This used to be a very popular research direction before neural networks when you use linear models. There's a feature engineering step where people define a lot of features. Many of these features are going to be relevant. And then you want a process that selects the features that are relevant. So this is kind of a static way of doing feature selection. And this corresponds to this column on the left. And on the right, we have something that I would call prediction explainability. So this is basically trying to select features on the fly. When you are given some input, depending on that input, we want to trigger what are the features that really trigger the decision of the model. Okay. And I don't have time to get into details, but there's tons of work on feature selection and model interpretability. And one way to summarize that work is dividing it into methods that are called wrappers, filters, or embedded methods. And we are arguing in this paper that we can have a very similar counterpart for each of these classes of methods for prediction explainability. So for example, sparse attention, which is basically an attention mechanism using Sparse Max or Arcmax, is something of the same spirit as embedded methods like using L1 regularizers. But we still have the same equivalence with other kinds of methods and other and wrappers and filters. Okay, so recently I just wanted to leave this pointer here. So we kept digging further on this framework where we have a classifier, an explainer, and a layperson, or a teacher and the students. And there is this recent paper that we put in archive that is kind of very similar to the above idea, but now it's doing something a little bit more sophisticated. We are using bilevel optimization, essentially trying to formulate the problem with a technique inspired by meta learning, where we try to see how fast a student or a layperson learns from the explanations that are provided by the teacher. And so if the student can very quickly learn from these explanations, so if the explanations are helping when they are provided in addition to the input example, this is a signal that the explanations are good. And it's a measure of usefulness to those explanations. And we can actually formulate this as an objective function and optimize this with bilevel optimization. And by doing this, we got very interesting results for NLP and computer vision that we are describing in this paper. Okay, so I think I'm going to skip this because I don't have much time. Yeah, okay, actually I need to run. Okay, so I'm just going to mention this one because it's going to be relevant for the thing that I'm going to describe next. So far I described sparse transformations that are defined over the simplex without any structure, but we can generalize the same idea to structures. Okay, so for example, if you have a latent variable in a neural network that represents a parse tree or something with some kind of structure, then we can also define a transformation that is going to result in a sparse combination of structures. For example, a sparse combination of parse trees. And to do that, we need to take another step and to define something that we call here sparse map. I don't have a lot of time to get into the details, but I will just give the main gist. We define a factor graph to capture the structure of the problem. For example, a factor graph could contain a factor that is capturing the syntax, the parse tree, and a few other factors that are imposing constraints. For example, what is the valency of each word, and so on. And then we can use this factor graph to define a sparse transformation, and we can also backpropagate through that to that transformation. So this is what is called a differentiable layer, and we provide all the machinery to make these steps efficient. Okay, so this is like a code snippet that shows how we can do this with just a few lines of code. Okay, so we are going to use this next in the context of structure rationalizers. And this is a paper that my student Nuno Guerreiro is the first author. So before getting into details, I need to briefly explain what is a rationalizer. So this is a class of explainability methods where models have, they are divided into two parts. There is one part which is called rationale generation, where a generator takes an input. So X here denotes the input. You can think of X, for example, as a review, and we want to compute the sentiment of that review, positive or negative. So there is a generator which is going to take X, and it's going to generate a vector Z, which is going to be a mask. Okay, it's going to indicate what are the words that are really relevant to perform the decision. So it's going to be a vector of zeros and ones. And then as we have Z, we are going to compute it. We are going to use Z to mask the X. Okay, so we are going to just select the things that are deemed relevant to perform the decision. And this can be represented as a element-wise product between X and Z. And then after masking those words that are considered irrelevant, the predictor only sees the others, and taken that input, it's going to make a prediction y hat. Okay, so this is the second component of the model, which is called the predictor. And of course, there are several criteria to generate Z. Most of the work that has been done so far uses some kind of stochastic approach for that. For example, by defining scores for every word, and then using those scores to define Bernoulli distributions, a probability for each entry of Z being 0 or 1, and then sampling Z from this Bernoulli distribution, okay, with some additions, for example, penalizing the length of the rationale, and so on. And if you want to do sampling in the middle of a neural network, this might be challenging. We might need to use techniques like reinforce. Reinforce was the thing that was proposed in the paper that proposed this in 2016 by Taolei. And another choice is to use the reparameterization trick. This is actually a method that performs much better in practice, proposed by Yasmin Bastings, that use Arcmax distributions instead of Bernoulli's. So here we wanted to see how well we could do in this problem by using deterministic methods where we don't need to sample. Okay, so one thing that we already had tried in the other paper that I mentioned by Marcus was using sparse attention for that. So by defining the sparse max transformation of what the generator produces, as opposed to having to sample. And in this work, we used something that we call Spectra, which uses a structure transformation to obtain Z. Okay, and I'm going to describe that very briefly, given the limited time that I have. Okay, so the idea here is that we are going to encode the structure and constraints as structure differentiable layers using LP sparse map, which I talked about a few slides ago. And by doing that, we are going to define a score for a vector Z as basically a score for individual words, which is represented in this part, plus a few constraints that can be either soft constraints or hard constraints. And the kind of constraints that we want to impose are things like having like an upper bound of the maximum length of the rationale. So we don't want rationales to be too large, otherwise they are not going to be very useful as explanations. So if we have a very large document, our assumption here is that only a few words are enough to form a good rationale, and this can be penalized by defining a budget, a hard constraint on the number of words. Other soft constraints that we use is encouraging that contiguous words that are next to each other, are either going to be jointly selected as part of the rationale, or they are going to be both ignored. And this can be done if we have a component of the model that provides scores to edges. So at the end of the day, we have a problem that we can, that is kind of a L2 regularized version of a maximization problem, for which we can provide an efficient forward step, and we can also compute gradients. So if you want to compare Spectra, how does it sit with the previously proposed methods? It kind of ticks all these boxes. We can have deterministic training. We have exact gradients. We can have constraints, and we can also model this contiguity property of works that are next to each other being jointly selected. All these things are useful in practice. So we tested this in two problems. I think I'm just going to talk about the first because I don't think I have time for the second. We use this to extract highlights from documents. And we also use the same technique to build matchings between pairs of sentences, which is useful if you are trying to solve a problem that involves sentence pairs. For example, entailment, machine translation, and so on. And for highlights, we had these soft and hard constraints that I mentioned before. And all these things can be computed very efficiently by using dynamic programming and an algorithm that we have implemented in LP sparse map. So the short story is that the stochastic methods, they can perform well. So this year we performed 5 runs of each method with 5 different random seeds. But one thing that we noticed, and other people had noticed the same before us, is that stochastic methods can exhibit a high variance. So if you run it 5 times, you can get 5 completely different results and sometimes they just fail completely. So they generate for some random seeds. This is less severe for Arcmax, but it's still less stable. With Spectra, we got both better predictive performance than the stochastic methods and also more stable. Okay, so the variance is much lower. We also looked at how often the rationales that are produced agree with the kind of human annotations, the kind of rationales that humans have written. And this is for the beer data set. We did the same for other data sets. And again, we see that Spectra and also Sparse Max, which is another deterministic method, as a good agreement. Arcmax is also very good in that sense, but again, it can fail completely. So if you look at the minimum, from those 5 runs, the worst performing method, it just didn't perform well at all. It was very, very bad. Okay, so these are some examples of highlights that we have generated with our model. And so the things in green are basically words that agree with the human rationales, and the words in red are words that humans wrote that the model didn't output. We can see that the model has a preference for selecting words that are contiguous. And yeah, so okay, I think I need to skip this. And how much time do I have? Is it do I have 5 minutes until the end? I think that's what my clock is saying. Can you confirm?
4 minutes, maybe.
4 minutes. Okay. All right. So I'm going to skip this part. We also use this for SNLI. If you want to play these things, there is code available. It's very easy to use. And I'm just going to give the main flavor of the uncertainty because I don't think I have a lot of time to get into this. So this is another paper also published at NLP by my student Taya, my postdoc Chryssa, and my collaborator Ricardo. And the idea here is to model uncertainty in the problem of MT evaluation. So MT evaluation, you have a source sentence in one language. We have the output of an MT system in a target language. You might have some reference translations, one or more. And the goal is to assess how good is T, is a translation as a translation of the source. And of course, this can be done manually, but it's expensive to do that, requesting human annotations. This is done with direct assessments, MQM, and so on. There's also traditional metrics for these that surely you've heard of, like BLA, Meteor, and so on. These metrics exhibit low correlations with human judgments. And so in the last years, there's been lots of progress with the learnable metrics like COMET, which has been devised at Unbabel, BLERT, BERT score, and so on. However, all these metrics have the same limitation. They always give you just a single point estimate. So they don't provide any confidence about that score. And in this work, this is what we try to mitigate. So basically, this is an example for an English-Russian sentence pair. Here, I don't know Russian, but the student that was the first author told me that this translation is not accurate. So for this particular translation, a human score called DA score here will be very low, but COMET actually predicts it as with a relatively high score. Okay, so this is not a good COMET estimate. And what we try to do is, instead of providing a point, have a confidence interval. So maybe COMET doesn't really know if the translation is good or not because the sentence is very out of domain or because some other reason. But if you can provide some uncertainty measure, then this will inform the user that maybe you should take this prediction with a grain of salt. In contrast, if you have a translation that is correct for the same source, then the interval could be narrower and maybe the model is more confident that this is a good translation. So this is basically what we want to do. I don't think I have time to get into details, but I'm just going to mention that we use very simple uncertainty quantification methods for this. There's different kinds of uncertainty that are relevant in MT evaluation that are different from other problems in NLP. For example, we can have aleatoric uncertainty that comes from noisy human scores. Humans can be very bad at estimating the quality of MT. you know, they have very low internet agreement sometimes, and this creates you know, some noise in the data. There's also problems sometimes with noisy references because data sets are not perfect. And we also have epistemic uncertainty that comes from translations that are complex, that the model does not have the right knowledge to assess if they are correct or not, or source sentences that are out of domain. Okay, so it's an interesting problem to try to disentangle these different sources of uncertainty. So in this approach, we just tried something very simple: Monte Carlo dropouts and deep ensembles. This is basically building different runs and trying to assess the variance of those runs. We evaluated these with you know, several different metrics. I don't have time to describe all of them, but just to give the quick summary, we you know, our methods outperform the baseline. The baseline here is just using a regular comet with a fixed variance and tuning that variance. So they kind of do what we expected them to do. Deep ensembles seem to be slightly better than Monte Carlo dropouts. There's many other experiments in the paper that I don't have time to get into. And again, there is code that if you want to play with this, I invite you to go and check. And okay, so I'm going to jump to the conclusion. So sparsity can be useful path for explainability. You know, the methods that we proposed here can handle sparsity, constraints, and structure. We talked about structure rationalizers in the first part. I didn't have a lot of time to talk about uncertainty awareness, but you know, there's still ongoing work that we are doing to better disentangle different sources of uncertainty and using more sophisticated methods beyond MC dropout and deep ensembles. So this is it. Thank you very much. And if there is time, I'd be happy to take questions.